Hello, I'm Barry Silverberg, Director of the Center for Nonprofit Studies at Austin Community College, and this is Civil Society, a periodic podcast to provoke more thinking about issues affecting nonprofit effectiveness and success. My guest today is Sandra Molinari, the Community Education Director at SAFE, Stop Abuse for Everyone, which is a merger of Austin Children's Shelter and Safe Place. She has about 18 years of experience in the social services field, and among her other distinctions, she's a graduate of our center's Certificate in Nonprofit Leadership and Management. Our focus today is on sexual harassment in the nonprofit arena. Sandra, welcome.
Thank you.
So I'd like to start off with asking folks, what made you get engaged in this arena, and what keeps you going?
Well, thank you for asking, Barry. I've been engaged in this arena, as you mentioned, for a number of years, close to 20 years now. I did not study anything related to social work, but after college and after living abroad in Latin America, I decided that I wanted to come back and work with women based on some things that I'd seen in my travels. And that led me to Safe Place a few years ago. And I do this work because I believe in social justice, and I believe that gender-based violence is very much a social justice issue. I have seen tremendous amounts of people, especially women in my work, heal and get beyond the violence that they've experienced, and that is tremendously heartening to me, and so I keep doing this work.
You've been doing it a long time. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that I read, or maybe you told me, is that sexual harassment often has nothing to do really with sex.
Mm-hmm.
Can you expound on that?
Sure. Sexual harassment is primarily about power. It's about having power over somebody else, and it's through behaviors that are of a sexual nature. So usually sexual harassment is about unwanted or unsolicited behaviors toward another person. It has, it doesn't matter what the gender of the perpetrator or the target of that harassment is. It can be people of any gender identity, but it really is about power. I have power over you, and I'm going to show you how, using behaviors that are going to make you feel uncomfortable, because I can.
Why is it, what has happened in our society that these issues are now so much on the public consciousness?
So these issues of sexual harassment and, more broadly speaking, sexual violence are nothing new in our society or any society. I believe that they're being talked about much more these days, in part due to the Me Too movement, what we saw happening last fall with the Me Too movement, and powerful, well-known women who are in the public eye speaking out about their experiences of sexual harassment and sexual violence. So what did that do? That brought it into the media, and because those women were speaking up, other women started speaking up, and that brought out other women and people, again, it's not just women, who started speaking up, and so many of them started speaking up that I think there was finally a sense that, wow, this is really, really more prevalent than we thought. When I say we, people in general, we know it's prevalent. And I think it helped survivors of harassment and sexual violence more broadly feel a little bit more comfortable maybe speaking out. And so then we had the phenomenon we've seen, which is so many voices being heard, either directly or even anonymously, but it's taken off like wildfire in many countries, in fact, which is really a beautiful thing to see, because it needs to be talked about. It needs to come out of the silence and the shadows.
So to avoid, well, I'm not sure. So how would you define sexual harassment?
So sexual harassment is about unwanted, unsolicited sexual advances or behaviors toward another person. In the workplace, it has a very specific definitions, but broadly speaking, it is about unwanted, unsolicited sexual behaviors. That can range from catcalling, so sexual gestures towards somebody. It can be, it can go to unwanted touching. It can be showing of the genitals to another person. It can be grabbing or groping somebody, and it can go all the way to sexual assault. So it can be a number of different kinds of behaviors, but the key here is that they're unwanted and unsolicited, and they make the target of that behavior feel uncomfortable or unsafe. Those are the main pieces, because what might be sexual harassment to me, if it was done to you, Barry, might not feel as scary or as disrespectful.
Right. So I think there's confusion, particularly around older generation folks who engage in certain kind of behavior, and now they're being demonized or being called out for it. How do you deal with that? I mean, education, but how do we reach beyond just the our contemporaries and?
I think we have conversations with people. So yes, that's coming up. We're hearing, well, it used to be okay to pat somebody on the back, or it used to be okay to give a person a compliment, and now we can't give compliments. That's actually not true. Some people welcome compliments, some people do not. It's about consent. So if somebody is not, if somebody is not comfortable with a compliment from somebody else, ideally the person receiving it could say, I'm not comfortable with that, and the person giving it would understand. So things have changed over the years, and so people who used to get away with certain behaviors now are getting called out. And so I think we need to talk with those folks and help them understand why their behaviors might be problematic. I don't know that it's helpful to attack them. I think it's really important that we have meaningful conversations and help people see how their behaviors can be perceived or received as disrespectful and unsafe.
And I think that's really important, because there are some people who, by the nature of their social acculturation, don't realize they're engaging in certain behaviors.
Absolutely.
So if I were the recipient of sexual harassment, what should I do?
Well, you have different options, and it also depends on where you are.
Let's say I was a female, just to make it, since most of the harassment is directed at females, although clearly males are also harassed.
Most harassment is directed at females, but men and people of other gender identities, especially if they're from marginalized groups, are more likely to be sexually harassed. So if you or a person is being sexually harassed, I would always recommend that if it feels safe, that you let the other person know. That's not okay, I'm really not comfortable with that, please don't do that. If you're feeling really comfortable, you can actually name exactly what happened. When you touch me without asking me, that makes me feel uncomfortable, please don't do that. Ideally, that would be a first step, and you would hope that the other person would respect your boundaries and the fact that you're not giving them consent to touch you. If they don't respect that, then depending on where you are, you might seek the help of a witness or somebody else to go talk to that person. If you're in the workplace and you're receiving that, you're being sexually harassed by somebody in the workplace, regardless of their position in that workplace, you have some similar options. You can tell the person directly if you're comfortable and feeling safe. If not, you can, depending on the policies that you have in your workplace, you can follow that policy. You can ask a witness or somebody who's seen it or experienced it to maybe help you report it if you feel comfortable doing so, or to talk about what they've seen, maybe to talk to that perpetrator. Again, a lot of these things depend on who it is, how comfortable we are. If we're in the workplace, it's often important to document it. So if I'm being harassed in the workplace, hopefully I would feel comfortable going to my supervisor or to HR, but I also want to document it for myself. God forbid if it should happen again. So that sort of thing.
So underlying all that is not to just accept it, but to take some kind of action.
Ideally, take some kind of action so that the other person knows that it's not okay. So we're setting boundaries. But also in a workplace, how can our employer protect us or take action if they don't know that it's happening? So ideally in a workplace, we would want to help our employer understand what's happening. And again, that's not necessarily a direct route if I'm not comfortable, but maybe the person who witnessed it can, with my agreement and my permission, go and talk to somebody.
So on our website, we're going to post the legal definitions and all
Right.
that sort of stuff. But for now, what kind of actions can I, either as a potential recipient or in office, a work environment, do to mitigate against, sexual harassment?
If you're a recipient of it.
Yes.
If you're a recipient of sexual harassment and you are comfortable doing so, I would report it. Ideally, in your workplace, you have clear policies and you know who to report it to. If you're not sure and you're comfortable going to a supervisor, I would report it to a supervisor. That supervisor is then going to have guidelines for what they're supposed to do with it. Ideally, it goes up to her, human resources. I would document it if I were you. If there were witnesses, I would talk to them and make sure that they're documenting and maybe talking with them about how to take the next step. But probably you want the behavior to stop, and that's why you're reporting it. So in order for it to stop, somebody needs to know about it, the employer, so that they can investigate and they can take disciplinary action if needed against the person who's perpetrating it. More likely than not, if somebody is harassing you in the workplace, they're harassing somebody else as well.
Right.
And so when we remain silent because we're scared or we don't think that it's going to have any effect, then we're letting perpetrators of harassment or violence continue to do it to other people. And so they're going to continue to use their power in that way.
So implicit in that message is that the recipient shouldn't feel and assume responsibility or guilt because somebody else is engaged in this behavior.
Absolutely not. The blame should never be on the victim. Sexual harassment, just like broader forms of sexual assault, are never the victim's fault. And I'm glad that you brought that up, because it's really important that as bystanders or as supervisors or friends of somebody being assaulted or harassed, that we believe them. We have a campaign called Start by Believing, because if you come to me, Barry, and tell me that something happened to you and I don't believe you and I invalidate you,
Right.
then you're probably not going to feel good about it. You're going to think that you brought it upon yourself possibly, and you're likely not to tell anybody else. And so again, the person doing it is just going to have a free pass to continue doing it.
Right. So let's shift a bit. So what's your sense of this issue of sexual harassment within the nonprofit arena?
So my sense is that,
And we know there are very, very few statistics out there, so
Right.
it's really just a sense from being in it
Right.
and with the viewpoint that you have.
Right. So having worked in the nonprofit arena for almost 20 years, my sense is that in many nonprofit agencies where we are trying to do social good and social justice, we are striving to be role models, and we strive to move away from these power differentials. And there may be fewer examples of sexual harassment, but I say may because that completely depends on the nonprofit. It depends on the leaders of that nonprofit. And what's saddening to me is to see nonprofits whose mission does not align with the leadership qualities. And so you have to ask yourself, does your mission of doing social good align with what your practices actually are? So I know that in nonprofits that I have worked for or that I have friends working in, there are instances of sexual harassment. There absolutely are. Although we work in the nonprofit field, we are still a microcosm of the greater society.
Absolutely.
And of the social norms and values in our society and in our culture.
Absolutely. My own experience working in the nonprofit sector for 40 some odd years is very often it is an abusive environment. People abuse themselves, allow other kind of abuse because we're so caught up in the mission. So what? Go ahead.
And if I might just say,
please.
some nonprofits, some small nonprofit, this might be a little bit more likely in small nonprofits, if you have a very charismatic leader that everybody looks up to, maybe they're the founder of that nonprofit, there runs a risk possibly of everybody looking up to that person. And if that person is a perpetrator of abuse or harassment, it might be less likely for victims to report or for those victims to be believed, because this person is seen as all-powerful and wonderful. And people who sexually harass and who do it discreetly are like other perpetrators of sexual or domestic violence. They might put on one face publicly and they're a different person in private. So that can be problematic as well.
So if I find myself the recipient and I could follow these processes you outlined, and there's still no satisfaction at the end in the workplace, do I go to law enforcement?
Well, that completely depends on you as an individual. You could go to law enforcement, understanding that if you go to law enforcement, that is going to require you to tell your story, and they're going to investigate, and if that's what you want, then by all means, encourage you to do that. A lot of victims of sexual violence in general choose not to go to law enforcement because they don't believe that there will be any real justice. While we respect that view, we also know that sometimes there is justice, sometimes there's not. There are a lot of factors in there. That depends on the victim of the harassment. It's an option, certainly.
So where do I turn for resources? If I'm just interested in this subject, I want to change my work environment, or any place on the spectrum.
Sure. So one of the resources in our community here in Austin is SAFE, Stop Abuse for Everyone, where I work.
I'm very surprised you mentioned that.
Surprised that I mentioned it, aren't you? So we have a wide range of services for survivors of sexual assault and exploitation, domestic violence, child abuse and neglect. And the folks that are advocates on our SAFE line, which is a 24/7 phone line, chat line, and text line now. We can be reached 24/7, and those advocates on the phones are well versed in sexual harassment and the other forms of violence and are ready to listen. They're ready to listen even if a person just wants to talk about what happened. They're also ready to give people information about what they can do. They can help people decide if they want to come in for any kinds of services at SAFE. All of our services are free to anyone who has experienced any of these forms of violence. And so sometimes if a person isn't sure, because sometimes we don't know, this thing happened to me, I don't know if it's technically sexual harassment or violence, I'm not sure, but it feels crappy, it feels bad, I don't feel, something's wrong. I can call the SAFE line, I can call anonymously, and they will listen to me, and they can help validate what I'm feeling, and they can tell me what services are available if I wanted to move forward. If I don't want to go to SAFE, I can call 211 and find out if there are other services, maybe counseling if I want to talk to somebody else, or I can still call SAFE and they can give me resources in other places in the community. But it's important, and we hope that people who are targets of sexual harassment or sexual abuse or assault reach out and talk to somebody. That's really important, not to keep it all inside. It's when we talk that we realize that people believe us. It's when we realize that we're not alone. That's what's been so powerful with the social media Me Too movement, is that we're realizing how prevalent it is, which is sad on the one hand, but on the other hand, it helps victims feel like they are believed. And it's only in working together and getting our voices heard that we can actually change things.
This has been fascinating. So to bring us to a close, is there something I may not have asked you that you would like to say?
Thank you for asking. I would say that it's important to realize that we are all part of the solution. And so if I'm a person in a workplace who is a good person, who doesn't sexually harass, who hasn't been sexually harassed, I cannot just get off the hook by saying, it's not my problem. I need to be aware. I need to be aware of my surroundings. I need to think about what is my role in creating a safe and respectful workplace. If I don't know about the policies in my workplace, maybe I can ask. I can ask, what policies do we have? Can we get some training? What's going on? And if I see something happening that might be sexual harassment or worse, it's important that I speak up to somebody, whether it's to the alleged perpetrator, whether it's to the person that I see who might be being harassed, and maybe check in with them and say, are you okay? I'm not sure about what I saw. Is everything okay? But we need to be bystanders. We need to be able to step in at some point and create that safe space. Because otherwise, if we say nothing, it's like any other forms of oppression. If I say nothing because it doesn't affect me, that I'm implicitly supporting that form of oppression.
So I totally agree. We need to be socially responsible and really try to create an environment with justice, equity, and fairness.
Yep, absolutely.
Well, thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Barry.
It's been a pleasure talking with you. Please visit our website, nonprofitaustin.org/civil society. to read more about sexual harassment, to see some of the resources we talked about, and to share your comments on today's podcast. This is Barry Silverberg with Civil Society, a Center for Nonprofit Studies podcast, in collaboration with the fantastic folks at ACC TV. Thank you for joining us today.